and not from the fringe. In truly extraordinary cases, I reserve the prerogative to vote no on confirmation or even to vote to deny an up or down vote. Just saying, I might filibuster. I'm already thinking about it. Same goes for his Republican colleague, John Kyle of Arizona.
Are you willing to pledge right now that the GOP will not filibuster whoever the president nominates?
It'll all depend on what kind of a person it is. I think the president will nominate a qualified person. I hope, however, he does not nominate an overly ideological person. That will be the test.
The Republican Party now threatening to filibuster a Supreme Court nominee who doesn't yet exist. Supreme Court nomination battles have brought with them a little bit of everything over the past 100 years or so, but Republicans are ratcheting up for a fight for the sake of the fight, one that's basically never been seen before, in the absence of President Obama even picking someone for the job yet. And that is worth remembering when they declare, inevitably, that the nominee is the worst communist, fringy, ideological pick ever. It's not about the nominee. It's not about the nominee. They're already pledging to filibuster before there is a nominee. They are just licking their chops for a fight for the sake of the fight. Do you remember the bong hits for Jesus case? Remember that case? The Supreme Court ruled in 2007 that a high school did have the authority to suspend a student from school for holding up a banner that said, "Bong hits for Jesus," at a school-supervised event. Justice John Paul Stevens wrote the dissenting opinion in that case, and that dissent was amazing. In the dissent, he wrote this, quote, "The current dominant opinions supporting the war on drugs in general and our anti-marijuana laws in particular is reminiscent of the opinion that supported the nationwide ban on alcohol consumption when I was a student." He's, of course, referring to prohibition, back when he was a student. Justice Stevens has been around for a while. He turns 90 this month. He appears to be in great health. As President Obama pointed out today in acknowledging the retirement news, Justice Stevens enlisted in the Navy the day before the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. He saw Babe Ruth's legendary home run in the 1932 World Series, the one where he pointed out where he was going to hit it and then he hit it there. Justice Stevens saw that live from the stands. He was there. Justice Stevens was appointed to the court in December 1975 by President Ford. That makes him the longest-serving justice on the bench right now by more than a decade. If anything, Justice Stevens is probably a Republican. He doesn't talk about his partisan affiliation, but he has hinted over the course of the years, over the course of his career, and at the time he was appointed, of being a Republican. And, of course, he was appointed by a Republican president. At the time, he was considered sort of a moderate conservative. And whether politics has moved to the right of Justice Stevens or Justice Stevens has moved to the left of politics, whichever it is, he is considered to be the liberal on the court right now. As the Washington Post said at the first recent signs that Justice Stevens would retire, his leadership of the liberal wing of the court is responsible for, quote, "groundbreaking decisions in favor of gay rights, restrictions on the death penalty, preservation of abortion rights, and the establishment of a role for the judiciary in the nation's terrorism fight." In Justice Stevens' dissent in Bush v. Gore, which, of course, is the case that stopped the vote recount in Florida and handed the presidency to George W. Bush, Justice Stevens wrote, quote, "Although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. It's the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the rule of law." In 2004, Justice Stevens wrote the majority decision in a case that ruled that prisoners being held by the U.S. at Guantanamo had the right to challenge their imprisonment. Justice Stevens is credited with bringing Justice Kennedy on board for the majority in a 5-4 vote that essentially gave the EPA the authority to regulate carbon emissions. When the Supreme Court ruled in 2007 that schools couldn't promote integration by considering a child's race when they assigned students to schools, Justice Stevens dissented from that case. In that case, the majority cited Brown v. Board of Education, the 1955 case that ended legal school segregation. They cited that in the majority. In his dissent, Justice Stevens called that a cruel irony. just this year in the Citizens United ruling, in which a 5-4 conservative majority ruled in favor of limitless campaign contributions from corporations, including even foreign corporations, Justice Stevens, in the minority, wrote, quote, "Our lawmakers have a compelling constitutional basis, if not also a democratic duty, to take measures designed to guard against the potentially deleterious effects of corporate spending in local and national races. The court's ruling threatens to undermine the integrity of elected institutions across the nation. The path it has taken to reach its outcome will, I fear, do damage to this institution." Justice Stevens so strongly opposed what the court did in this landmark Citizens United case that he read aloud from his partial dissent when the decision was handed down. They never do that. According to people who were there at the time, Justice Stevens did not read aloud from his decision very well because he is almost 90 and he said he was tired that day. But the fact that he did it, the fact that he not only wrote that sort of blistering condemnation of the ruling and felt strongly enough about it that he needed to read it out loud gives you some idea of the degree to which Justice John Paul Stevens has been the anchor of the court and the leader of its liberal minority. With Justice Stevens leaving the court, it's losing its true blue liberal magnetic north. Keeping the status quo on the court, therefore, means finding a replacement for Justice Stevens who is as liberal as he is. What are the odds of that? Joining us now is Dahlia Lithwick, senior editor and legal correspondent for Slate.com, and the person who I most wanted to read as soon as I heard about this vacancy. Dahlia, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
What are the odds that the court doesn't get less liberal in the wake of Justice Stevens' departure, that President Obama nominates somebody who will be, I guess, as reliably liberal as he has been?
Well, I think you really flagged it in your intro, Rachel. There's two issues. One is how liberal the next person is. The other is, will they have the mastery and the skill to Sherpa the other liberals along? And that doesn't even really touch on that next nominee's jurisprudence. That's about a question of how do you handle this court, this sort of fractious left wing of the court? How do you handle Anthony Kennedy, who really does need to be Sherpa'd along? So I think it's not just a question of how liberal the nominee is, but do they have these foundational skills, these Brennan-like skills, to get to 5? And that's a really, really tough find.
Dahlia, when you wrote about this on Slate, one of the things you described was the empathy factor, which of course became such a hot-button issue during the Sonia Sotomayor confirmation process. The president today said he's looking for somebody with a keen understanding of how the law affects the daily lives of the American people. How important was that characteristic to understanding Justice Stevens on this court?
I think it's critical, Rachel, and I think it's something before we all sort of pounce on the demographics question and the diversity question, before every woman in America starts screaming we need a third woman, before we start screaming we need an Asian or Hispanic or a gay or a disabled justice. It's so important to honor and recognize in Justice John Paul Stevens that this was a rich, white, waspy guy who didn't grow up in the projects, who went to the right schools and had all the breaks and still managed throughout this amazing decades-long career to kind of get it about what it is to be a prisoner at Guantanamo, to get it about what it is to be a mentally retarded person on death row, to get it what it is to be a 13-year-old girl who's strip searched because there might be, God forbid, Advil in your bra. And so I just think it's really critical to see that quality. I know it's a bad, bad word. Empathy is synonymous in the GOP with some kind of derangement that needs medication. But really, I think that if you look at Stevens' great gift as a jurist, it's that simple ability to put yourself in the other guy's shoes. And one of Stevens' former clerks, Sonia West, and I wrote a piece today in Slate essentially saying, before we go crazy trying to find a justice who looks just like us, let's recall that John Paul Stevens doesn't look like a lot of us, but he really got us.
Justice Stevens told Jeffrey Rosen in 2007 for that long magazine piece that Rosen wrote, he said, including myself, every judge who's been appointed to the court since Lewis Powell in 1971 has been more conservative than his or her predecessor, except maybe Justice Ginsburg. Do you think that's true? Has it been a really steady march right on the court?
I think it's indisputably true. I mean, I think he's citing data that is I think, unequivocal, that everyone is succeeded by someone slightly to their right. And we certainly see that, I think, with David Souter, who's succeeded by Sonia Sotomayor, who's much, much more of a pro-prosecutor bench. We saw it with John Paul's, with then Chief Justice Rehnquist being succeeded by John Roberts. And probably the seminal replacement is the moderate Sandra Day O'Connor being